if you think about it, you can probably realize that the cells that you use to see things, i.e. the rod and cone cells and of course the nerves associated with them, are not the same as, say, your skin cells. Okay, so they are both types of specialized cells. Now, a specialized cell in textbooks is usually defined as something like a cell that can perform a specific function. The thing is, all cells can perform specific functions. For example, if you have a unicellular organism like an amoeba or a paramecium, well, they perform a specialized function. They reproduce. That's very specialized. They make more of themselves. But a more detailed definition of specialized cell would be that it is anatomically and biochemically specially modified to perform a particular function in a multicellular organism. Or even in a unicellular organism. Why might this be? Let's think of it. What sort of specialized cell might exist for, say, a type of amoeba or a protist? Well, they could have spores. So the pond is drying up, and sensing the change in conditions, these cells form a resistant outer shell, and, well, in some cases they will divide their DNA so that they basically divide into a new cell, and the parent cell forms a hard casing around it. This is the case for many bacterial spores, such as, well, anthrax. Now, when you do that, the parent cell eventually disintegrates and the spore sits there, and it germinates after some amount of time. Now, this amount of time is somewhat random. Why? Well, think about this. If you have a big patch of bacteria that all started with one cell, then they're all genetically, in theory, identical. So if they all form spores, and the spores generate randomly, you can have several spores germinating each day, and for 100 years, and you still have a bunch of spores that can still germinate. So what does this do? This means that whenever favorable conditions reassert themselves, the rest of the spores may or may not be sensitive to these conditions. It may be that they don't react at all, they just germinate at random. Whenever favorable conditions come again, they will most likely still have spores that germinate at the right time, and I think that communicates it well enough. Now, so we see that even for unicellular organisms, there are specialized cells. Now, the human body is a multicellular organism. We have many, many different types of specialized cells, all originating starting from the fertilized egg, which itself is a very specialized cell. The average human cell is typically characterized as a fibroblast. It looks nothing like a fertilized egg. The egg cell is a gamete, the sperm cell is a gamete, the fertilized egg is still nothing like the standard human cell. So it is also considered a specialized cell. So these are parts of specialized cells. So these are, to be specific, they are cilia. This is found on, say, the lung lining and the tracheal lining. So these cilia sweep mucus. The orange ones that are labeled in this false color electron micrograph are goblet cells. So they secrete mucus, and the cilia, the ciliated cells, sweep the mucus along until it reaches essentially your throat. So there, once they sweep the mucus over, the mucus ends up in your esophagus, and whenever you swallow, well, the mucus goes down into your stomach and is digested, along with whatever's in it, say viruses, bacteria, fungal spores, or dust. Now, the same thing happens for snot. It gets swept to the back of the nasal cavity, and from there, well, you will eventually swallow it. And this may sound incredibly disgusting, but it is an efficient use of resources compared to letting it constantly drip out everywhere. Also, it's less of a trail, because if it drips out everywhere, well, other animals or predators can track you by that trail. Whereas if it gets swept down and recycled, it's not as easy to track. Now, red blood cells, they are a type of cell that is so specialized they do not have a cell nucleus. So they are basically sacs of just hemoglobin and a few enzymes that keep the cell more or less maintained. That's why they wear out in about 120 days or so. Now, even though it is true that your skin sheds a layer approximately once a month, technically skin cells can be considered to live considerably longer than that because, well, there are many layers of the epidermis. And depending on the area of the epidermis you're dealing with, well, there may be more layers, such as, say, at calluses. i.e., when you, say, write too much, you may develop a callus on part of your finger. That is a patch of sickened skin. So that's more layers of epidermis. Now, the layers take time to wear away, and thus any particular layer might live for longer than you might think before it actually dries out and dies. The epidermis is technically all dead skin, but the dermal layer under it is dividing and replacing the epidermis all the time. So, muscle cells. Well, muscle cells are arranged in bundles called muscle fibers, and depending on the organism and the type of muscle cell, they can look very different. But for the most part, muscle cells are long, so they may have some indentations, but in general, they're still long, well, fibers that stretch the length of a muscle. Say somebody's biceps. The muscle fiber stretches almost the entire length of the biceps, and eventually it joins connective tissue at either end, i.e. the tendons. Now, fat cells have a big vacuole. Not only plants have large central vacuoles, but fat cell vacuoles are full of triglycerides, so fat molecules. They store energy for not only the cell, but the organism. Now, other plants may also store, or unicellular organisms may also store energy as fat. That is stored for the organism and for the cell. For multicellular organisms, essentially all the fat is stored for the organism, not so much for the cell. Now, white blood cells, well, they kind of act like amoeba. Amoebae, technically, and they will engulf, say, bacteria or viruses. They also hunt down and kill cancer cells, but for basically everybody who has ever had cancer, they, for the most part, aren't good enough. Why? Well, if your cancer grows large enough to be diagnosed, if your tumor gets big enough to be diagnosed, that means the white blood cells weren't effective in stopping it. However, it is true that white blood cells regularly catch tumor cells that are in the process of trying to start a tumor and kill them. So, those are considered natural killer cells or cytotoxic cells. But that's a story for later, biology class. So, nerve cells are long, thin, and have many branches. For the most part, though, they can have many branches. So here might be this main cell body, and it might have lots of branches, sure. I am drawing this not very much to scale because actually these can be quite wide. But there will usually only be one, at least for the most part, one big one. So this is called an axon. it also has branches at the end. Now, the relationship of the axon and the cell body in terms of position may vary. Some cells have a cell body in the middle of the axon. But that actually doesn't matter very much because the cell body in those cells, which are mostly sensory neurons, does not actually have dendrites, which are these ones that stick out the main body. The main purpose of a sensory neuron is to transmit an electric impulse from one end of the axon to the other end of the axon. Now, for other nerve cells, obviously it's a little bit different. They will sum up, say, electric impulses on the main cell body and transmit it down the axon, or alternatively, take the information from the end of the axon and transmit it up to the main cell body, where other cell bodies may have dendrites touching particular dendrites and thus may get signals. Now, often you will need more than one impulse to actually trigger a nerve cell to move, so to speak. Technically, nerve cells don't move. What they move is ions. So these ions movements will allow this nerve cell to transmit an electric impulse. The details are for later. So, bone cells. Bone cells, they collect calcium from food and, well, they collect other ions too. For example, strontium locates strongly to bones, which is why strontium is used to identify bone cancer, a particular radioactive nuclide of strontium. Now, bone cells grow and repair bones. They build up bone around themselves, and in some cases there are surface shaping cells that break down bone at the surface to keep it relatively smooth. And I say relative for very good reasons. Bones are not all that smooth. But bones are, for the most part, hollow. Why? Quite simply, it's to save weight. And of course, also to provide space for, say, bone marrow. But especially in birds, which have really, really hollow bones compared to humans and most land animals, well, birds have really, really hollow bones so that they can fly. Because solid material is pretty heavy compared to, say, air sacs. Now, sperm cells, here we see a bunch of them trying to bore into something. And they are capable of moving independently. They carry DNA from the male parent to join with an egg cell from the female parent. Sperm cells are cheap. Egg cells are expensive. Think of, say, an ostrich egg or an emu egg. They are huge. In fact, some birds have eggs that when you look at an X-ray, it's basically half the body in size. That is a huge investment, which is why males tend to go for quantity when searching for mates, and females tend to go for quality. It's because if you can only have a few investments, you might as well make each one as good as possible. And, well, sperm are cheap, so you want to have as many investments as possible. Now, this may sound sexist, but it is biological fact. I mean, next, it is not sexist on the same basis that saying, oh, more men tend to grow beards than women is sexist. Well, no, it's not, because, well, I think we all know. So, some animals that are active mainly at night will have specialized cells that emit light. Now, other animals rely on specialized organs that emit light. How do they do this? Well, some types of deep sea fish secrete a chemical attractant which attracts a particular type of bacteria. This type of bacteria is not normally light emitting when it's free living, but when it inhabits the organ of this fish, it receives particular signals that make it conduct particular chemical reactions to release light. This is a case of symbiosis. Please note that spell check of all types will not like biology class all that much. although it is still much better than science class once you get to, say, naming particular compounds, especially in, say, organic chemistry. Now, plants also have some very specialized cells. For example, Xylem cells are dead. They are dead because once they form, they die and hollow themselves out. So they are just tubes that allow water to go straight through them. And this is a lot more efficient than transporting water from one cytoplasm to another, through membranes. Now, other cells transport dissolved sugars. These phloem cells, for the most part, they're also not exactly alive. Why? It's because they get rid of all their organelles, so that basically they're just an empty cell membrane that is kept functional by the neighboring cell. Now, this companion cell keeps the phloem tube technically alive, as in filled with cytoplasm instead of just water. But this cytoplasm essentially still undergoes bulk flow with what amounts to a sugar solution. We call this sap. Now, it's not the watery sap you get when you tap into xylem. It's the sort of sap you get when you tap into a tree bark, because the phloem is part of the bark layer, sort of, depending on interpretation. Why? It's because the anatomy of a tree trunk is actually quite complicated. Now, inside we have xylem. And then out here somewhere we have a layer called the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium divides to produce phloem on the outer edge and xylem on the inner edge. The phloem does not divide, which means that the phloem, as it goes outward, it gets narrower and narrower proportionally. The amount of space in between is filled in either with cracks or with cork cambium. The cork cambium is what produces the bark. Now, if the bark cracks due to the fact that the stresses between the layers are too much, then if that breaks through the cork cambium, a new one forms deeper within the phloem layer. Now, what does this say? This says that if you tap into a tree for sap, the first thing you will meet is, first of all, obviously bark. Then you will meet phloem, which means you will get the sweet sap instead of basically just water in the xylem. Now, older xylem tends to get clogged up with stuff like lignins and such, and thus be useless. This stuff, this darker wood in the middle, is called heartwood. But we'll cover this later in another lesson. Now, in plants, there are also cells that are specialized to store stuff. Namely, well, the solution that flows through is, for the most part, sucrose in most plants. And what about minerals? Well, what do they flow through? We know that most minerals are ionic compounds, and thus they will flow in water solutions through xylem. Now, what happens to the sucrose once it arrives at, say, a potato root? Technically, a tuber in a potato is an underground stem, but that's not the point. There are plenty of underground roots or stems that are all reckoned as tubers by common lingo, even if it's technically inaccurate. So, what happens when it arrives at, say, a potato? This sweet sap, well, that can be gathered together into these starch storing structures. Why starch? Well, in plants, to store starch or glycogen in plants or animals respectively is more efficient in terms of the amount of food energy stored versus the amount of food energy that has to be spent to store it than storing fats. So even though the starch itself has lower energy density, it's more effective. Fats are used when plants want to move, i.e. in seeds, and other applications where weight really matters. Or alternatively, as in the case of palm fruits, because palm oil is actually extracted from the fruit, not from the seed. Now, in the case of palm fruits, that's to attract animals to eat it, which is, of course, a very important application of life's resources, to reproduce. After all, the number one mission of all life forms is to reproduce. Of course, this does mean that most life forms are naturally in cycle because they cannot do this reproduction thing sustainably. If there's too many wolves, the moose population falls, and the wolves start starving because they ate all the old and sick moose. And the ones that are left, they cannot take down effectively. So, these starch storing structures are usually specialized plastids. Now, plastids are a category of organelle, and chloroplasts are a type of plastid. Most plastids are derived from chloroplasts of one pigment type or another. Now, that's for later. And on plants, there are, like on animals, epidermal cells to keep the outside out, and of course, the inside in. But in plants, because of the cell walls, you don't really have to concern yourself too much about keeping inside in. You mostly have to concern yourself about keeping what's outside suitably out. Now, on young roots, you have root hairs. What do these do? These increase the surface area of the root through which it can absorb, say, minerals or water. On older roots, where the outer layer is thicker, you will not see root hairs. For example, we've probably all seen trees where at the bottom of the tree we see some roots coming out. Well, those roots are covered with bark. They most certainly do not have these root hairs on them. And then there's the more prototypical plant cell, which is a photosynthetic cell. These photosynthetic cells have special organizations inside leaves. So say this is the upper surface of a leaf and the lower surface. We usually have a palisade layer right under the epidermal layer. The epidermal layer has cells, and it also has a wax layer on top. Wax, epidermis, and upper epidermis. And then we have a palisade layer. What is a palisade? A palisade layer is, named after a palisade. And a palisade is a bunch of basically wooden logs with the top ends sharpened to a point that have been planted in a row next to each other. So basically a wooden fence. Now, a palisade is used to defend against attacks and raiders and wild animals. But I think it was a pretty good comparison to these long, elongated cells that are tightly packed together so that they can capture as much sunlight that comes in as possible. And then you have spongy mesophyll, so a bunch of cells that basically exist just to keep up the structure of the leaf. These come in various shapes and sizes. And of course you have the bottom epidermis. And in some places you have guard cells, which control the size of stomata, and thus control water loss and gas exchange. Now, these gases don't just come through very easily because of the wax layer. Now, of course, the wax layer has breaks in it to allow these through. So we know that plants use carbon dioxide and water to make sugars, and we know that the water comes from the roots, and that the carbon dioxide comes from the air, hence why we have these guard cells. Now, we point out that before plants came onto land, they, for the most part, resembled lumps of this. Because, in water, do you have to guard against water loss? Yes, you do. In, say, salt water, then either you have the same concentration of solutes as the seawater outside, in which case you still have to regulate the types of solutes you have inside the cell, or if you have a different concentration, you have to maintain the difference, which takes energy. Now, in summary, all multicellular organisms are made out of mostly specialized cells. Even unicellular organisms have some options for specialized cells. For example, spores. Now, spores are a term that we use for basically anything that's supposed to survive really harsh conditions that the organism normally can't survive. It also has to be unicellular, usually. Now, there are spores where it contains, say, a zygote, so a fertilized egg, that may or may not already have undergone a few divisions. Now, usually, when we use spore, we technically mean that it's a single cell. The spores that contain a zygote or so on can be known as, say, zygospores, or other similar terms. Specialized cells have structures that allow them to perform specific functions. So, for example, ciliated cells have cilia. Goblet cells, well, they have a lot of rough endoplasmic reticulum. They have usually multiple Golgi bodies. Why? Multiple Golgi apparatuses allow many vesicles to be processed at the same time in terms of secreting mucus. And of course, spores have really thick walls and are usually chemical resistant and also to some extent heat resistant. They also have really slow metabolism. And well, let's think about the specialized cells. Well, okay, skin cells, they divide often and they form many layers of epidermis, which are all dried out and dead and full of keratin. Keratin is a relatively water-resistant protein, so this, for the most part, reduces the rate at which water is lost through the skin, or alternatively, gains through the skin. What do you think happens when you soak your hand in water for too long and it comes out all pruny and wrinkled? That's because your skin has been soaking up water, and thus, well, what do we know about dry things soaking up water? For the most part, they have a tendency to expand, unless, of course, it's air spaces that are being filled up like a sponge. So, they expand, and thus they get a little bit too big for the underlying flesh, and thus they distend a little bit with the underlying flesh, and, well, your hand gets wrinkly, because the surface is now bigger than the inside. Now, a specialized cell performs one primary function instead of doing everything an organism has to do to stay alive. This is usually considered the main difference between specialized cells versus the typical definition, which is that it can perform a specific task. Now, reproduction is a very specific task, and it's a task universal to life. So everything from an amoeba to humans has to reproduce in order to continue existing and to exist today. However, an amoeba is not considered a specialized cell because, well, it can do everything an organism has to do to stay alive. A fibroblast is a specialized cell, even though it's considered relatively unspecialized. A stem cell in humans is unspecialized, but we call it undifferentiated. Differentiation is the process that we use to describe, during development, unspecialized cells becoming specialized cells, or rather, undifferentiated cells becoming differentiated cells. So for now, though, we just consider the fact that multicellular life has many different types of specialized cells. And, well, that's it for this chapter, and we'll see each other again next chapter.